In this lecture, we're going to do something that, from the viewpoint of many people, is just simply outrageous. We're going to move from two figures who at least have some things in common, and that's Foucault and Habermas, both of whom deal with the problems of what I've called modernity, and I hope that word hasn't thrown you too bad. It's not such an abstract word. It means the processes by which factories were instituted based on the division of labor, and the processes by which institutions came to be rationalized, rule governed across the whole terrain of our social life with few exceptions. That's the process that I've been referring to as modernity, and far from being abstract, it's a part of our everyday life. It's called work, it's called hooking up the telephone, it's called applying for a job, it's called dealing with the IRS. This is modernity. So don't get lost in the fanciness of the word. That's modernity. I've argued that it has these pathologies. Foucault has argued it's had them. We've also argued that it has an upside, and I mentioned in an earlier lecture that it's better to have a toothache in the modern world than before. It's also better, I mean, across a whole spectrum of medical problems and other kinds, it's probably better now than it was then. Certainly if you want to get from here to California, it's better now because it's much faster, although even that's probably debatable. In any case, with that, with a little bit of tie-up of the other lectures, let me begin with this outrageous attempt to try to deal with perhaps one of the trickiest and strangest philosophers, if he is a philosopher, around today, and that's Jacques Derrida. I think his name has become synonymous with a kind of evil among many analytic American logic-chopping philosophers. I mean, Derrida is responsible in many ways for deconstruction, that dreaded enemy that has invaded our literary departments, that according to popular mythology tells us that any way to read a book is as good as any other, that there's nothing outside books, that we're always reading, and every reading is a misreading, and so on. Now, in my view, Derrida believes none of these things that I've just outlined. I'm trying to give you the popular demonizing mythology about Derrida. I've brought in just one of his books today to show you, but he's written many. This is Margins of Philosophy. Its title is very significant for Derrida's project, which is to examine philosophy as a broad, long-standing cultural institution stretching back to the Greeks, and to try to do so in a framework that reminds us that philosophy, so understood, is the product of Indo-European languages, to the extent that we know what that phrase means, and the product of Western civilization. It is not an eternal project in the mind of God, but a project with a certain materiality, a certain history, and that many of the most interesting things that we will find out about philosophy won't be from reading it badly or from saying any reading of a book by a philosopher is as good as any other, but will be by paying attention to the very things the philosopher tried to repress in his text, the things that the philosopher tried to put on the margin, as it were, of the text of philosophy, the things that the philosopher wished to exclude. By drawing our attention to these, Derrida in some ways is like Freud. Freud wanted to investigate things like slips of the tongue, jokes in the relation to the unconscious, and so on. In a way, Derrida's meta-philosophical project is to investigate philosophy's slips of the tongue, philosophy's unconscious witticisms, and so on. So this is not an unworthy project, and it is rooted in a profound concern with that earlier figure that we discussed at not nearly enough length, and I won't have nearly enough time to do justice to Derrida now. I just want, if I can dispel a few myths about him, I will have done some good in the world. Because even a brief meeting with me convinced me that he was just a fairly jolly French person and certainly not out to tear up the American university system, and that the image by right-wing lunatics conjured up of lesbian deconstruction literary critics dancing at Brown University, burning Chaucer and Shakespeare, is utterly a fantasy of paranoid dimensions that surpasses anything that the John Birch Society ever dreamed up. Derrida is an academician, he is a very careful reader, and he has some unorthodox views about language and about the history of philosophy. And since I have at least one very good friend who knows his work well, I will draw on some of Louis Mackey's remarks today, and I will also draw on the Americanized version of Derrida that has been presented to us by Richard Rorty. Now, I'm not saying Rorty fully subscribes to everything Derrida says, but Rorty is one of his American admirers. To the extent that he is, that is, as it were, put Rorty in the enemy camp as well, which he is to many analytic and positivist-minded philosophers. Rorty is one of the enemy. It's kind of hard, since Rorty's closest philosophical analog would be Dewey. In a way, he is very American. And in certain ways, Derrida is more American than the Brits that we use as our models for much of the analytic philosophy we do. I'll try to explain that as I go along. Okay, let me give you something that I was asked for by a reporter from the Chicago Tribune who was covering the debate over deconstruction, and he went, "What the hell is this stuff anyway?" So this 45-minute lecture to an hour will be an attempt to answer that reporter's blunt question, "What the hell is this stuff anyway that's causing so much trouble?" I'm going to try to answer that. Well, deconstruction as a term originates in Heidegger's project that I've already discussed, where I said that Heidegger wanted to perform a deconstruction of metaphysics. A deconstruction of it. Not a destruction, but a deconstruction. In other words, to sort of dig through it, underneath it, to read it in such a way that he could uncover, in some sense, the hidden history of being. Now, as his project progressed, and that's being with a capital B I just used, as Heidegger's project progressed, it became more and more obvious to him that it was futile. That being is, being with the big B is, blank, was a blank that was going to be difficult to fill in. So in the very late Heidegger, when he wrote the word being, he drew a line through it, like that would help. He'd write the word where you could read it, but he'd draw a line through it, which he called writing being under erasure. Now the point of that was this. This is its connection to modernity and the things we've been discussing, including the self. In the medieval period, beings, entities like us, found our meaning in being, and ultimately in the being, the highest being. In fact, philosophers, I sometimes think, when they use the word being with a big B, mean something like God, but just aren't straightforward enough to say it. It certainly seems, I mean, in a certain way that seems to be the case.